Welcome, welcome, welcome. I want to welcome you all to this last session of the New York Society for General Semantics of 2017. I think we've had a really spectacular year with some wonderful programs, and it's nice that we can finish it out tonight with this very special one, this very educational one. I just want to ask, could we turn the music off? It's nice to have that background, but maybe a little bit of an interference. Okay, and I want to start with a little preamble here that General Semantics has long been concerned with the uses, the misuses, and the abuses of language as the primary form of human symbolic communication. We look at language as a tool, a technology, a medium through which we learn about our environment, make sense of our surroundings, evaluate and act upon our world. Language is the foundation of human intelligence and the basis of time binding, which is the general semantics concept of being able to store and keep knowledge, preserve knowledge, and pass it on to future generations. So it refers to our capacity for learning, both as individuals and especially collectively as a society and as a species. Now, it comes at no surprise that the process of learning and education are also among the most central concerns for general semantics. And over the years, leading educationists such as Neil Postman, and Ashley Montagu and Jerome Bruner have been associated with general semantics. And general semantics itself represents an educational movement in its own right, one devoted to incorporating the benefits of scientific method to human relations and improving our means and methods of evaluation and understanding and maximizing our human potential. When we go back to the founder of general semantics, Alfred Korzybski, and he described general semantics, what his aim was to create a teachable system, one that could be understood and applied by everybody, not just effete elite intellectuals like our panelists up here and yours truly. But early in the 20th century, play was identified and recognized as an important part of the learning process, not as sort of childish diversion, but really as a key element in learning. And that is closely connected to our capacity for symbol use and language learning and cognitive and emotional development. The role of play, and with it creativity in education, has gained increasing emphasis in recent decades, along with greater interest in the interactions and interdependencies among speech and language, literacy and media, and art and media as they all relate to learning. To sum it up, in education, as in theater, which is appropriate for our surroundings, the play's the thing. I appreciate the few of you that laughed at that. And so, tonight's program on the theme of play, learning, and language features three prominent panelists. So it's a little hard. Three prominent panelists. To my left, my immediate left, is Robert Albrecht. Bob is a professor of media arts at New Jersey City University, a school that doesn't really know how to punctuate its name. He is the author of Mediating the Muse, a communication approach to music, media, and cultural change. He's also a musician and songwriter with 2 CDs out, and is currently working on a new book called, with a tentative title of The Arts as Pedagogy in the Age of Digital Technology, subtitled Teaching as a Creative Activity. To his left is Michael Plew. Mike is a professor of communication at Manhattan College. He's the immediate past president of the New York State Communication Association. He's the internet officer and executive board member of the Media Ecology Association, and just recently appointed to the New York Society for General Semantics Board of Directors, and he's currently researching innovative initiatives in schooling. Sorry. He also knows a good applause line when he hears it. And finally, to his left, Margaret Cassidy, Peggy, as our friends know her, but you can call her Professor Cassidy, is professor and chair of communications, is it, or yes. I think it's with an S at
yes.
Adelphi.
I think it is still.
Yeah, should look into that. At Adelphi University, a past president of the New York State Communication Association, the author of Bookends, The Changing Media Environment of American Classrooms, and just recently, a new book, Children, Media, and American History, Printed Poison, Pernicious Stuff, and Other Terrible Temptations.
Do you have a copy of it?
That's good. It's in the car. I did bring them, but I didn't bring it in.
But all of these books are on Amazon, so in any event, as you know, I'm Lance Straight. I'll be your host for this session, and we decided that we would begin with short statements of interest and ideas from each of the panelists. But they didn't have any. No, I'm just kidding. But we'll begin with that. We'll then go into some interactions and ultimately turn it over to questions and comments from the audience. But we'll begin.
Are we going to have a chance to play?
You're already playing with me by asking that question, so the answer is yes. We'll begin with Bob.
Thank you, Lance. Hi, my name is Bob, and as Lance mentioned to you, I work at New Jersey City University, which used to be called Jersey City State College. It's in Jersey City. And that's important because in Jersey City, at college, you're getting a lot of working class students, a lot of them first generation. So when I grade papers, it's always a challenge to me because a lot of them, English is their second language. So how do you grade a paper if it's the second language? You can't hold them to the same standard. And a lot of my scholarship, and I've also worked with children for about 35, 40 years in Jersey City. So,
how old are the children?
6 to 12, in that bracket. And so during the summers, I work with the children, and during the school year, I work with college students. And a lot of my scholarship is concerned with music. Lance mentioned a book that I wrote called Mediating the Muse, and that book is about how changes in technology changes the way we experience music. Obviously, if you have a mechanical means of experience music, a phonograph, radio, a CD, or what have you, it's different than if you experience music through singing it. So if we were to listen to a particular song right now, if I put it on the CD, or if we were to sing that song, it'd be totally different experiences for us. And I'm also very interested in education, and my current focus is on how changes in digital technology are changing the nature of childhood. how children are being educated, how children are being socialized, because it's totally different. And there's recent studies that show that, and this isn't surprising, I don't think to anybody here, that increase of digital technology is becoming more and more important in the lives of young people. Every few years it goes up, and at the present, it is now at a point where children are spending more time with digital technology than any other activity, including sleep. They're spending more time in a mediated type of context than even sleep. And a lot of young people sleep with their laptops next to them and their cell phones under their pillows. So their sleep is even interrupted by digital technology. And the concern, and Lance mentioned a book that I'm preparing with a colleague, is that we're kind of concerned about the consequences of this massive flow of digital technology into the lives of children. And I don't think we're taking it seriously enough. We're just thinking it's like, well, it's here, what are you going to do? And we've already observed, I think everyone in here has observed, and certainly there's research to back it up, that there's something very addictive about digital technology. If those of you who teach, your students can't put it away. It's very, very difficult. I tell my students to put it away, and then boom, they got all kinds of ways they're looking at it. I'll understand this. There's a reduction in the ability for people to focus. All right. When I give my lectures, it's every semester I have to take them down a minute. I think I'm down to like 7 minutes. After that, I've lost them, and so I have to keep on making them shorter. Reading is becoming more and more of a challenge for young people. Many young people cannot read deeply. They kind of scan it and they don't quite understand it. They're trying to get through it as quickly as they can. Young people aren't as active physically. Because I work with children. You ask me, children 6 through 12. A lot of these kids are just spending their free time sitting at their desk looking at a computer. So they're not out there. They're not jumping rope. I live in Jersey City. All the girls used to be jumping rope all the time. I barely even see that anymore. And there's a lot less physical activity. And of course, with digital technology, it's ironic that we call it social media because a lot of it is very isolating. So anyway, I'm working on this book with a colleague of mine. Am I going on too long? Just pull the
Oh,
program.
yeah.
No.
It's
You're doing great.
All right. Well, the interesting thing is that I started working with this program in Jersey City 35 years ago, right at the same time I was working at NYU on my doctorate. That's where I met this guy. All right? All right? And so I was working with children during the day, 7, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old. And then in the evenings, I'd go to class with Neil Postman. And so it was almost inevitable that this was going to happen, that what I was studying at NYU, theoretically, would start to melt with my experience working with children. And fortunately, the program I was working with in Jersey City, they were using arts as a way to work with children, not to teach children to be artists. We weren't trying to develop like a virtuoso singer, a virtuoso musician, or a great actor, or a great painter. It was using more the arts as instruments of learning. For example, using drama in the classroom with children in Jersey City to get them involved in the story. Like we did War of the Worlds, the Orson Welles. Well, to really get the kids involved in that, where they would play parts in that story. Not as a play. There was no audience. We were just going to play, just like the way kids play. Do you remember when you were little and you used to play games and you used to just get into it?
Yep.
That's what we did. Except you could use it as a teaching method to get the kids writing in character. And I would have the kids write little newscasts of what happened, like in the story. The aliens landed on a farm out in the farmlands in New Jersey, right? Well, they'd come on television, and I'd be the anchor, And then I said, I'll pass it over to, Johnny. Johnny's going to tell you about. So it forced the child to speak to a whole class. It was public speaking, plus the child had to organize his or her ideas. And then they would have to interview people for the story in the classroom who would be enrolled as characters who had actually seen the alien spaceship. So just to give you an example. And so encourage social interaction, encourage his writing. And I'm also a musician, and I'd always do a lot of singing with kids. Once again, I'm not trying to train the next great singer, and I myself am not a great singer. I'm not a virtuoso guitarist, but my whole mission was to get the class to sing. And teachers would comment to me, "They're so good after you leave." Well, I brought them together. You can't assume that a group of 25 different kids from all different ethnic backgrounds, all different types of problems at home. In a place like Jersey City, you got all kinds of crazy problems in their homes, that all of a sudden they're going to come to school and get and work together. So you have to kind of work at that. And so I used to use music to do that, storytelling, and I used to do a lot of games where they would have to interact with one another, speak to one another, and share experiences with one another. I think I'm going on too long, right?
If you think you are.
Okay, I'll just say one last thing. Now, although I don't work in the classroom with children anymore because I'm teaching full-time at a college, I still work during the summer. We have a summer camp in Jersey City. It's a day camp. And for 6-7 hours a day, the kids are in an environment where there is no digital technology. They're told, leave your digital phones at home.
Mhm.
You don't need them here. Put them away. We have college students working. Put away your phone. Put away your phone and go home. All right? We told you this when we were hired.
It says that.
Huh?
Say that again. Put away your phone and go home.
Go home. Go home. All right? Come back tomorrow. All right? We told you when we hired you, we don't want you on your phone. All right? And we try and get the children involved in a setting without digital technology where they're going to sing. We're going to sit down, we're going to sing together. All right? We're all going to sing a song. We're going to learn songs. We're going to sing them every day. We have a time of the day where we have storytelling. Someone's going to tell a story. We have lots of recreation, lots of art you can do. And we're going to put on a play. If you want to be in the play, you can be in the play. If you don't want to, you don't have to be. All right? If you'd rather play basketball, go play basketball. But we're going to have a play. So it's kind of a rich environment in oral expression, oral communication, which I think a lot of children are losing out on. A lot of interpersonal things that a lot of us who are of a certain age grew up with that. And I'll just close with one example. I grew up playing baseball. That was my love. When I was a little boy, there was no such thing as too much baseball. I got up in the morning, bam, I was out on the street, and the other kids in the neighborhood would come out in the street, and we were playing stickball. If there was 2 of us, we'd have a catch. If there was 3 of us, it was running bases. 4 of us, now we got a game. 5 of us, even better. All right? And we learned how to organize a game. There was no adults. There was no coach. Kids can't do that. They can't choose up sides. They can't make sides. I was in Central Park, and I'll finish with this. And I was watching 3 different games. What's the place where they have all the baseball diamonds? Is that the Great Meadow? Where do they have all the different baseball fields?
I don't know where that is.
What is that?
It's
Anyway.
near the Sheep's Meadow?
Sheep's Meadow. So it wasn't Sheep's Meadow, but
It's not near there, is it?
it's near there. What is it? Whatever it is. And I was watching 3 different games at once because you could see all these different games. One was a group of these Latin guys, and they were just into it. These guys were playing the game, and there was like about 8 of them, and they were just really into it. And over here, there was a group of women playing, and the women were all different levels. Some of them were really good. They knew how to play. And there were other women who looked like they never played before.
Talking about baseball?
Softball. And the woman who knew was showing the other woman, now you put the glove on this hand, and this is how you play, and this is how you hold the bat. And then there was a group of kids, and about 13 years old. And I was watching, they couldn't get the game together. There was about 16 of them. And first of all, they had trouble getting sides together. And finally, they got sides together. I mean, it took like a long time before they actually decide what the sides were. And then they couldn't decide what the positions were, because every kid wanted to pitch. And he said, no, you can't all pitch. And they couldn't get the game together. Finally, they got the field together, and then the kids up at bat, they couldn't get the batting order together, because every kid wanted to be up first. And there was this poor kid out in right field who just fell on the ground and started banging the earth. It was like a half hour, and they still hadn't started the game. So I think oral communication, that we take it for granted, those of us of a certain age, that we learn that as a kids. Think just about softball. When you're playing a game, how to do that, how to choose up sides, how to assign positions, how to do a batting order, how to know when somebody is safe or out. That's always an issue in baseball. Are you safe? Is he out? Is that ball fair? Is it foul? All right. When do we end the game? Are we going to play 9 innings? Or are we going to stop when it starts to get dark? Somebody has to go home because his mother's calling him. When do we stop the game? I think a lot of children growing up today, because they haven't had that opportunity to experience that, really don't know how to do that. Well, you going to take a question? Not yet.
We're going to just go through our introduction.
But there's nobody there to help them organize.
But there was no, that's what I'm saying, that they haven't learned that skill. No one taught me. I learned it from playing.
But somebody told you how to
The
organize.
School of Hard Knocks.
The School of Hard Knocks, yes. You know my teacher.
I was one of those kids.
So somebody has to help you to
Thank you.
organize.
No. We'll talk about that later.
Okay. Thank you,
Thank
Bob.
you.
So we'll go to Mike.
Before I say anything that sounds smartish, there's a whenever I come to either attend one of these or participate as a speaker in one of these things, I find that like in the weeks or the days leading up to them, there's various serendipitous things that come up on the topic of the event or the talk, and it just happened out of the blue that last night or the night before I was with my children. My son's almost 11 and my daughter's 9. Wanted to tell me all the riddles that they knew, and I've heard all of them before, but my memory is such that I couldn't quite remember them until they were about halfway through. But I thought I'd tell you one of them as a way to talk about language and play, and I think it has something to do with learning. And if you already know the answer to this, don't blurt it out. Just entertain this with me for a minute. You find yourself in a room with no windows or doors. You're trapped. And the only thing in the room with you is a board and a saw. How do you get out? Anyone's welcome to
I'm like,
chime in.
I've heard that, but I don't remember.
Yeah. Any guesses?
It's a
That's
play
not
on
really a
words.
riddle.
Well,
is it?
they called it a riddle, and I don't like
It's
whatever.
more of a puzzle.
Well, it ends up being a language play, actually. I mean,
Yes.
any stabs at it? What would you do? You got a board and a saw, and no windows and no doors.
What kind of board? Wooden?
Yeah, just a wooden board,
A Ouija board.
a Ouija board.
Which?
You got a board of directors and a saw. So I'll give you the answer. You saw the board in half. 2 halves equal a hole. You crawl through the hole. Right? And so, of course, they're thrilled with this story. And it struck me that that for a child who is still playing with the various meanings available to them for a single word, that's a thrill, right?
Yep.
You know that word has 2 meanings, don't you? And I'm like, yeah, I have a pretty big book. I have a PhD. I hopefully, I had to pass a GRE and the rest of it. But for them, it's really exciting. And it strikes me that attitude towards language play is exactly how you begin to open up a world bigger than the one you currently occupy as a child. It's through riddles and terrible knock-knock jokes that you just, like, I want to just hit myself in the head repeatedly until I'm unconscious when they start with the knock-knock jokes, but, the interrupting cow. Right? Knock-knock, who's there? Interrupting cow? Interrupting cow? Thank you very much.
What's the answer?
All right. Interrupting cow.
Interrupted cow.
Moo.
Moo-hoo.
No. I have to hear these things repeatedly, and you know, maybe
No,
you've
no.
heard some of these. Who's there?
Howard,
Howard who?
I'm okay. How are you?
See, I'm leaving. I'm gonna slug the rest of that wine and leave. Yeah, but you know, so the disconnect between a parent or you know, someone who, an older sibling even, who has to sit there and listen to all these things, and the child who's first discovering the power of language in this way, is that, you know, as they're playing with language, worlds are opening up to them. They get to see how other people react. They feel clever in that moment, and they get the sense of some sort of power that they have with this little tool that's nothing more than the words that they've learned up to that point in their life. And I think...
But words have entirely different meanings now than they did.
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, some jokes don't work anymore.
I'm not talking about jokes. I'm talking about when you say, what's a word that you use in your computer's language?
I don't know.
Well, give me one word that's used in computer language.
Mouse.
Mouse.
I don't know.
Well, maybe we should just.
Right.
Okay, so at any rate, right? So they open up a world to themselves by exploring through language, and I think it's interesting that this kind of wordplay has some power. Whenever I think about the issue of play, well, play and language, those two words evoke a single person for me, and I think that's partly through the conditioning that I went through studying with Lance years ago, that the name George Herbert Mead comes to mind immediately. And George Herbert Mead, sociologist from the University of Chicago, writes this wonderful book called Mind, Self, and Society, right? That's the order, Mind, Self, and Society. And in the course of discussing the way that human beings use play in order to develop a sense of the generalized other, a sense that I'm going to assume these various roles in order to understand how the world functions, understand how to expect other people's reactions to my communication, to my action. We develop this sort of complex self that we can shift between different understandings in different situations and mobilize our superpowers of communication in a particular way. But I went back and started to read this again because that name comes up, and a really interesting word, I think, is found in a section in his discussion of play. The word is attitude. And Mead talks about the idea that we assume a particular sort of attitude towards our environment, towards our situation, and towards others around us when we play in order to try on these roles. And I think the word attitude is really interesting. We like to talk about points of view and perspectives in this kind of thing, is understanding other people's points of view and understanding other people's perspectives. And you know, I've been conditioned also to be wary of visual metaphors in the course of my study, is that, you know, we tend to talk about things in visual terms, and I think attitude is a really nice, it's a more holistic and full human experience sort of word, because the roots of the word attitude have to do with positionality, they have to do with, well, I mean, they have to do with your position with respect to other people, and that's more than just a visual metaphor. And you know, as I think about the role of play and learning in particular, I think in whatever environment we're experiencing play, in a broader sense of the definition of the word play, we're taking an attitude towards other people, towards situations, towards the structures around us in a way that they reveal themselves to us. We do this as amateurs. When, as in the example of my children playing with language, they're amateurs in the use of language in order to affect their environment, in order to control their environment or empower themselves in their environment. And through sort of this amateur use of language, so things are revealed to them that we take for granted. And I think the other end of this is what happens when you become so expert in a thing that you fail to see those structures any longer. They become normalized. I think some of that is the business of general semantics and the idea of consciousness of abstracting in general semantics. How do we become conscious of abstracting? One of the ways that we learn to be conscious of abstracting and our use of language is, you know, through the system that Korzybski puts in place. And certainly there are books and there are programs and so forth designed to sort of call our attention to these things, wake ourselves up. But I think there are other things as well. I mean, I think the idea that we continue to play with language, We use humor, we use puns, we absorb ourselves in poetry and various other kind of things, including indulging our children's knock-knock jokes and riddles and puzzles and, you know, funny little stories is a way to continue to see the world through new eyes. And I think whether it's from the amateur point of view or I guess I would call it the artist's point of view, when you, instead of taking things for granted because you've been so professionalized in whatever this thing is, you've become professionalized in the language you use through schooling or through your actual vocation, is taking the perspective of the artist and assuming a different attitude to your environment is a form of play. It isn't only games. It isn't only, you know, these things that we think of in terms of play, frivolous and recreational and so forth. Is the attitude of play is what distinguishes the artist in revealing truths about an environment that's all too familiar. The attitude of play is what makes children explorers. And I think, I guess to put a sort of fine point on it, one of the things I'm interested in is how to preserve the value of school in shaping young people and not so young people even to function well within the structures that exist, including school, but including being members of a public, being members of a democracy in our case, and making it work well, and right, instead of taking it for granted. We have to reveal these structures and live through them in some way, and school's a place to do that, while at the same time recognizing that we've overstructured our environments. Is that, you know, this business about children not able to organize a baseball game, it's because their experience with baseball is structured play dates followed by, you know, a 4 o'clock practice that ends at 5:30 and off to the next thing. And I think overstructuring our lives, be it as children or as adults even, we need to take an attitude of play again. We need the freedom to be able to do that. And so, you know, we have these mandated curricula and so forth for children in schools. And the thing we get mad about is testing and teaching to the test, when in fact the thing I'm most frequently upset about is that there's no room to explore any longer. There's no room to revel in the sense of amateurism in the environment for us to explore. Last thing, and then I'll finish what I have to say. Another serendipitous thing is that a person on their Facebook page last night, was upset at the idea that so much play was being introduced in school because their children, the person had a kindergartner, and the kindergartner wasn't able to sit still and so forth. And I had to laugh, right? You know, of course they can't sit still. They're 5 and 6 years old. But, you know, the concern with what you're supposed to be in order to fit in school is a pressure that I think young parents probably all feel at a certain point, is maybe there's something wrong with my child. But a woman posted a comment that I really loved on this post to say, understand that when your child is in the bathtub and bouncing a ball up and down in the water, they're learning physics. They don't have the cognitive development. Their brain is not capable of that literate sort of orientation yet to think about things analytically. But you're priming them to be able to understand through experience and play something that will benefit them later. And I think that that's the sort of attitude that we would even benefit from in the structured environment of school if we opened it up more and weren't so concerned with checking all these boxes. Anyway, I'll leave it.
That's great, Mike. I just have to bring up, I just saw on Broadway Come From Away, and they had there was actually at the end, it was, and it takes place in Newfoundland or in Canada, called Newfies, and say, why can't a Newfies can't tell knock-knock jokes? And I said, why? He said, well, try.
Knock, knock.
Come on in, the door's open. Anyway, with that...
How do you follow that? I don't know.
Yeah. With that, I'll turn it over to Professor Cassidy.
Okay, so I thought it might make sense for me to say a little bit about this new book and what I was working on and how it relates to the topic for tonight, and then a couple things that have just been sort of bouncing around in my head that are sort of related to that work and to things that you guys have already said and all that good stuff. So the book, which by the way, the subtitle, all those fun expressions, that was going to be the title of the book, but then the publisher said, no, you need something with keywords. So it became Children, Media, and American History. Subtitle, Printed Poison, Pernicious Stuff, and Other Terrible Temptations. And those phrases, I didn't make those up. Those were from primary source documents in the 19th century.
Interesting.
From people writing about things that kids were reading mostly and playing with, and how the adults felt about those things. And so the book looks at a couple of points in American history where something was shifting or disrupted in the media environment that affected children, and in most cases the children involved were really pretty excited about it, and the adults were not as sure that this was so great, and it mostly had to do with the way that the adults saw this shift as either changing children's access to information that adults wanted more control over, or access to people that adults wanted their kids not to access, or vice versa, people's access to their children. Or there's another one I was going to say, and now I forgot, but it'll come back to me. So the point is that in order to do that work, to write about those things, I also had to be looking at children's experiences broadly, right? Not just with the dime novel or the comic book or whatever, but certainly this has to do with their play experiences, because pretty much all of these in the book, certainly, but most children's play experiences have something to do with media, right? Whether it is the dime novel or the comic book or going to the movies or playing the video game, there are often media involved in children's play then and now. And it also has to do with children's educational experiences, because that's a big part, well, except for the kids who weren't in school at various times for various reasons, and that's important too. But to the extent that kids were in school at times that I was writing about, what was that like? And I hear there's another really great book out there about times when people tried to use new media in schools, and so schooling is affected by media as well, right? Whether it's that people want to bring those media into schools, or whether educators want to try to somehow counter what they think media are doing to the children, right? So it all kind of comes together in some way. And so this is stuff I've been thinking about for a long time and writing about, and always happy to talk about. And in particular, though, two things that are not so much in the book, but are just sort of related, and as I say, just things I've been thinking about. One about very small children and one about very big children, that you might want to play around with tonight. One about small children is, I'm probably preaching to the choir here to talk about all the research, the old research and the new research about children's language development, right, and how essential it is for kids to talk with adults, for adults to talk to children, talk and talk and talk to them and talk some more, and not just talk at them, but to have conversations. And have you seen this research about how even if your toddler, if you have no idea what the toddler is saying, act as though you know what they're saying, and it actually matters, right? It actually changes how well they develop language, and because it's not just about the vocabulary, right? It's about turn-taking, and I'll get back around to baseball, I think, in a minute, but turn-taking, listening, empathy, right? Imagining the other person's position, crafting an appropriate response, and all eye contact, gesture, all of that stuff that goes into the communication act. And that makes me sometimes think more about parents. Like when I teach media and children, which I do a lot, every now and then students will say, this should be called media and parents, because you're talking so much about the parents. Is that, because it's, well, I'm saying that, right, in the voice of students, right? I can't talk about one without the other, right? Because how do you do that? So what was I saying? I was saying that I often think about, without sounding too old and cranky about it, but this whole issue of distracted parenting. And I have two kids. I'm 5 years ahead of you. My son is 16, my daughter's 14. And there were no smartphones when they were little, so I know that it's possible to be distracted without phones, because I know I was grading papers and trying to be department chair and stuff at the same time as having them. So it's not that the smartphone has ruined us all, but the idea, I do wonder about important adults, whether they're parents or caretakers, nannies, whoever, where kids have to compete for that person's attention, you know, and what that's going to mean in the long term. If we think now, and you're absolutely right, I mean, we're all doing this, right? If you think now that it's hard to convince students to put their phones away for a little while and to just give you or each other a little bit of attention, I can't imagine who's coming next, the ones whose parents are doing it, are modeling that for them, you know. So I'm thinking about that with respect to really little kids. With bigger kids, I'll express this purely anecdotally, because I'm not sure even what my point is, except that I find it very interesting, which is, anecdotally, my son is 16. He has an Xbox, and I don't know who's familiar with what here, but so it's a video game console. It's one of the popular ones, and it is a networked device, right? So the point is that he loves his games. He logs in to Xbox Live, right? I think, and he puts on his headset, which has a microphone, right? And so that connects him potentially to whoever else is logged in. And I guess what I want to say is how sort of strange and interesting and weird it all is to me, in the sense that initially it was, I'm sure I'm just like everybody else who's lived this, where he's talking, and for how many months did we say things like, are you talking to me?
Right.
You know, and sometimes he is and sometimes he isn't. Like if it's about food, he's probably talking to me, right? But otherwise he's probably not talking to me, but he's talking to someone, and I'll have to ask him, like, on the screen, now show me, is that you walking around in that world, this one here, because it seems to have like a name on it, is that you? And then these other people walking around shooting things too, are those things in the game, like code in the game, or are those other people in the world who are also on the game like you are? Mm-hmm. And he'll explain, because sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other, and sometimes it's both. And sometimes it's his best friend who lives across the street. And that's so interesting to me. They've been friends since 3rd grade, you know, now they're, in 11th grade. And it's so funny how rarely they get together in person. Or when they do, because they do, they'll hang out for a little while, but then they need to go home to their respective homes to play together, because you have to be on separate devices to play together. And it's so funny. It was always my fantasy that they would use Morse code, because we can literally see Rahul's apartment right out there, like across. We know when they're home and stuff, and they know when we're home. And I always wanted them to be like flashing it. It didn't happen, but I don't know. I didn't try that hard either. But I always wished it would happen. But so anyhow, my point is that there are all these different layers of interaction going on, right? With the game, with his best friend, with other people he has never met. With friends from school who he rarely sees outside of school, because one of the characteristics, I think, of contemporary teenage life is, at least in cities, is that you're all commuting in, right? Like he goes to a school here on the Upper East Side where kids come from Staten Island and the Bronx and Westchester and Connecticut and Poughkeepsie, which is crazy. But, you know, so they see each other at school, but then they all go off and they're not gonna physically see each other, but they meet on the game. And it's not all terrible, I guess is my point, because it's sort of odd how, like, his friends from Regis, they'll meet up on the game and they're running around shooting things, and then I'll hear him, like I was there one day when I saw my son say to his friend Nick from school, wait, look, that inscription, it was in Latin. What did it say? And their 2 little killer selves with their guns like ran back over to read the inscription, you know, because they're both taking Latin. It's a Jesuit school, right? So it's just an odd combination of things, right? Of different kinds of interaction with strangers, with friends, with classmates. It's just very complicated, and I don't know what I think. So, but it's certainly a thing that is happening now that's different from the pickup game, whatever. And absolutely, no question, having watched my own kids go through stuff like this, everybody says it, but it's true, I think, how incredibly overscheduled kids are. And even if you don't overschedule your kid, everybody else's kid is overscheduled, so there's no one to play with. You know, I have the luxury of being home a lot, and when they were little, I was home a lot, because the days I wasn't teaching, I was home, and summers and stuff. So I didn't have to put them in summer camp and those week-long camps when they're off from school. I could always kind of work it out, but it was hard to find other people to play with. And I mean, my husband goes crazy over the whole baseball thing, where once upon a time, I know it sounds so silly, but once upon a time, kids just got together, right? We let them go out and find each other and play and figure it out, right? And put the game together and whatever, figure out the rules, make up rules. Where now they're just never allowed to do it. They don't know how to do it because we never let them do it. Last thought, because now what we're also seeing is incredibly anxious college students and young adults, and there seems to be this connection, right, between never allowing them to learn how to handle something, and then when they have to, we didn't mean to, but we've taught them, I don't think you can do it. I have to coach. I have to organize it. I have to do this because we can't trust you guys to just do it yourselves, and the world isn't safe. We can't let you out in it. When really, look at New York. I mean, it's not the 70s. It's cool. Like, get outside. Go to Central Park. Anyway, so there.
Wow. I'll just say, my son is 24 now, so he had a little bit of that, kind of social interaction on Xbox. And once it went to college, it all, got kind of displaced. So, there's hope on that score. It was just like, I think, with baby boomers. We grew up watching television, and when we got to college, television completely vanished from our lives, except on the occasional late night drunken evening, where. But I wanted to, I mean, just in response to all this, bring up a few points. And you started with the 19th century. So, I mean, back in the 19th century, we had the idea of homo faber, that human beings were by nature laborers, workers. And in the 20th century, the philosopher Johann Huizinga replaced that with homo ludens, that is, that by nature we play. So that is a new way of looking at what it means to be human. But by all accounts, when we look at animal behavior, we see playfulness going on there. And Gregory Bateson makes this great point that if you look at the behavior, you can see it in dogs. It's of course goes back to wolves, where they engage in a kind of play, in a kind of ritualized play, where they determine their rank on the social hierarchy by wrestling. And rather than actually the dominant wolf ripping the throat out of the subordinate wolf, the subordinate bears his throat, and the dominant puts his mouth on it, puts his teeth on it, but doesn't actually bite. And in that way, through that kind of play, they determine their social rank. And Bateson points to that as a kind of beginning of symbolic activity. So again, the idea of play and symbolic communication as being linked. And I think it does speak to this idea that play and language are connected. Play and language acquisition. There is that idea. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the George Herbert Mead, who really introduces this idea of play and role playing, that we play roles, and in that way learn how not only the symbolic part but the interactional part. We learn how to behave in a social situation through this kind of role play, where say the parent says to the little child, no, 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 and the child turns to a stuffed animal and takes on the parental role, no, no, no. And Bateson then says, well, a role is half of a relationship. Right? Which is sort of that's why it is about parents as much, median parents, because there are no parents until we have children. This is something that children don't get, because they think we were always the parents, but they don't realize that they turned us into parents. So it's through our relationships that we define each other through this role play. So I think that's where this idea of empathy comes in with play. And so many of you have pointed to that oral connection. It is a kind of oral culture. Play existed as oral culture. The jump rope rhymes, kids taught them. The older kids taught it to younger kids. When you were brought up the baseball, right? Older kids taught younger kids how to play stickball, how to play baseball. It wasn't the parents imposing that structure on it. But again, there's that other side, that fascinating point. Many layers of interaction. The Latin in Xbox. I mean, that's weird, but I mean, it also brings to mind there are people like Stephen Johnson. Our friend Doug Rushkoff, early on, he changed his mind later on. We all do when we get older, but when we're younger, we say, well, there's something to be learned from all this, that maybe play with digital devices is educational and does teach us something new. So I'm going to turn this over now to you for your comments and responses to this and to each other. I don't know, do you want to go in order again, Bob? You want to? Or you want to pass?
I'll just say, you brought up the thing about the riddles. One of the things that we do with children at the camp is that we eat with the kids, because they have to learn how to eat. How to not to scream at the table. Yeah. No one begins to eat until everybody's served. Then we do like a little breathing exercise, so we all calm down a little bit, and then you clean up after yourself. But how to hold a conversation. And one of the things I always do with the kids is riddles. So, because you're playing with your mind with riddles. And I think I found with a lot of children, I don't know if this is Jersey City, maybe not your kids, they don't get a lot of the riddles, like the plays on words. I have to explain, like every riddle I have to explain it. No. Because they don't get the plays on words, so they're not getting that. So I think that's important. Just the word play is really important, and to be able to hold the conversations, I think that's really important. So,
I thought, I didn't really talk much about any of the digital business in what I had to say, but it strikes me that, my son in particular wants to play games all the time, and we really try and limit how much he's allowed to play games. And it's not only the amount of game playing that concerns me, because I grew up, I was born in 1971. As a kid in the late 70s, television video games started to come about, right? Really rudimentary Pong and this kind of thing. And then by the time I was in my early teens and in my college years, we wasted plenty of time playing games. And, mostly the people I know turned out okay, myself not included. But so it's not even so much the amount of games that concern me today as the sort of games that are played. My son and his friends always want to play Minecraft, and the concern that I have with this particular form of game is that I feel like almost everything in our culture is pushing us towards total immersion in digital environments. Is that the separation that we currently experience by putting our phones in our pockets or by closing our laptops, or something is in our unconscious connecting to these systems. The fear of missing out, right? FOMO is a real phenomenon. We can't stop sort of in the back of our minds at least thinking about these things. But the actual total immersion, where there's no difference between tasks because they're all performed in a digital environment, is probably somewhere in our future, as we speed towards things like virtual reality and so forth. And Minecraft, and here's sort of the point, if you play Mario, right, if you play Super Mario Brothers or any of those things, the gameplay is governed by dying, right? It's like you can die several times, but eventually time's up because you used up your 9 lives or whatever it is, and game's over, and right? But with Minecraft, it's a totally immersive environment, and there's something interesting, and school teachers and parents think, oh well, at least they're doing something creative in there, building a castle, right? Creating an entire virtual landscape to occupy and walking around in it and constantly manipulating it. And I'm always of the mind that what's the end point of that? When do you finish playing that game? What's the natural point of satisfaction that, well, I can't do that anymore. I've either accomplished the goal and the game ends. There's a stage, there's a boss to kill, there's something. But that these sorts of things are sort of structuring expectations of how to satisfy yourself, and what's the satisfaction? The satisfaction is continuously playing. That strikes me as being the real concern, is how our technologies are leading us into a continual need, the continual need for satisfaction by being immersed. And I don't know what to say beyond that about it at this point, but that's what concerns me mostly about the digital turn, is the move towards total immersion.
Oh, it's me. Well, I'm having a thought that's not exactly related, but I'll say it anyway because, I'll find a way to make it related. Thinking about college-age students and their immersion and absolutely their reluctance to, their discomfort, disconnecting for a little while. Even I teach short, 50-minute at a time, 3 times a week classes, so it's not asking that much to say, would you put it away? Just 45 minutes, just give me 45 minutes. But what was I going to say? That something about immersion. Oh, that one thing, I don't know, because you all teach undergrads, right? If you have noticed this, I know other people have said this, and I've noticed it. In some ways, it's odd that in the past few years, it has become much less necessary, I find, to shush students. In other words, if they're if they're bored and start talking to one another, or if they're interested actually and start talking to one another, like there isn't enough time to call on everybody, so they just start talking to each other about whatever we're doing. There used to be a lot more of students talking to one another, and I used to find that annoying, although now I kind of miss it because it doesn't happen anymore. It just doesn't happen anymore because they don't bother. Like, there's no need to say it to you because I can, I'm just doing whatever I'm doing, it's they're talking to someone, but it's not each other, and I don't even know where I'm going with this either, but that it's interesting. I rarely really succeed unless I want to be like the real, put your phone away, like really nasty. I mean, there's just no way to do it unless you're gonna like get a box, like in the movie High School Musical, just got a bucket, and you don't know what I'm talking about, but there's a movie that teenage girls have all seen, and we own them all. There are 3 of them, where this one teacher has this bucket and she makes all the kids put their phones in the bucket, and she puts it somewhere. Unless you're going to do that, they're going to look at their phones. They're just going to, right? And but one time not long ago, I managed, I don't even know how, to get them not to, and it was a whole different semester. It was really, I was back to actually having to tell them, shh, let's hear what, come on, shh, which was sort of like, oh, this is great. They're talking to one another, something, I don't know.
No, it's important.
Yeah. It kind of brings to mind Sherry Turkle's last book, Reclaiming Conversation, that, the lost art of conversation, and, on account of the use of digital devices. And we can certainly look at conversation as a kind of game, if you like, that there are rules, there are roles, there's turn taking, as we've all talked about. So that, isn't conversation a kind of play in a way, or at least, as you talked about how you start out with little children, or with infant toddlers, that it starts out as play with them.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've been concerned with in a classroom environment, and I think this relates to sort of the aims of general semantics and the idea that there's something to be done about all of it, and there's something that can put us back in touch with something that's important, I've done several exercises in classrooms over the years that are inspired, I think, by general semantics in some ways. If we're going to get back to a place where people are comfortable and somewhat versatile and expert in having conversations and expressing themselves, there are building blocks that are just missing, and they go back pretty far. And I think that the first level I've played with is the idea of silence on the objective level, and literally using silence in a classroom. I come from a Quaker schooling background, and as a young person attending Quaker schools, they'd always put us in these, it's unprogrammed meeting where everyone in the community sits in a room silently together for 45 minutes. And as a child, that was a difficult thing. As a teenager, it was a difficult thing. But everyone I speak to who's been through the same experience says, by the end of it, I really learned something valuable about it. And I could go on about other things about that, but I think the key thing is trying this with students. I've tried this with undergraduates. I've even tried it with graduate students to say, where in your life is there silence any longer? Especially not only in terms of literal silence, in terms of sound, in terms of an absence of sound, but where your mind is quiet. And we've I feel like people have turned towards yoga, especially for these kind of things, right? It's something about the body and it's something about being fit, but it's also, there's that spiritual element, and part of the spiritual element is just to be quiet, like not have to deal with all the stuff, right? Including other people, and maybe especially other people in a world that's noisy, even when it's literally silent. And they can't do it at first. We try 5 minutes, and it's unbearable to students when we've tried this for 5 minutes. And I typically do this over the course of a number of meetings where we extend it out to 15 minutes. And we talk about it each time and what the difference is in the experience and so forth. And I mean, where do we go to be in touch with silence any longer? It's from silence that sound emerges. And truth is, I taught orality and literacy, and that this is sort of an orality and literacy, a lesson that, if we want to understand the power of our own orality, our sound emerges from within us, but it's silent around us. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And the other thing, and one more thing is in the literacy. Sorry. In the literacy sense, I've done a general semantics exercise with students where it was in order to put people in touch with vocabulary. It was an exercise in writing to use words rich in meaning, to not talk about things in terms of good or bad, but to actually be more expressive and build a vocabulary. And I chose in this exercise, I did this in Japan with second language learners actually, which was an additional level of complication, to write a paragraph describing to someone who wouldn't otherwise know what it is, to describe sushi without using the verb to be in any of its forms. And now I've done this with undergrads at Manhattan College as well, and that's a really fun exercise. But I think these kind of things, these are forms of play with things that are at once familiar but require more attention, that require some sort of conscious attention, that have really, I think, helped students and have opened them up to learning about things like general semantics and media ecology. It has that added benefit, I think. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Yep.
I was just thinking as you were talking about a conversation I had recently. My university has a school of advanced psychological studies, so we train clinical psychologists. I don't personally do it, but my university does. And talking with a psychologist who works in particular with adolescents, and I can only take her word for it, so it's sort of anecdotal, but she was saying that what such therapists are finding, back to the anxiety thing, right, is that they think, and maybe there's research that supports this at this point, I don't know, but they think that part of what's happening is that with this incredible rise in anxiety among teens and young adults, is that they cannot tolerate the noise in their own heads. In other words, when you take away the devices that they use to distract themselves from everything that's going on in their minds, and they have to just sit with their thoughts, it's very distressing to them. And that's the key to everything, right? Is to learn how to do that, how to just kind of work with it and just let it sit there, and you learn the more you do it. But it's very hard to do, especially at first, and especially when you've never had to. And so it's something that therapists apparently are struggling with teenagers in particular.
Interesting.
Well, I'll toss out a few things that come to mind off of all of this. One is Wittgenstein. Of course, there's the early Wittgenstein and the late Wittgenstein, and the late Wittgenstein, which is not the dead Wittgenstein, but the late Wittgenstein says language is a game, looking at it that way. Of course, Goffman also uses game along with theater, and it's the double meaning of play, is, both playing in games and playing as acting. There's also transactional analysis, and Eric Berne, probably his best-known book was Games People Play. This is part of the 60s thing, but there was this idea that all of our interactions can be understood as games, and that's where you say, you're playing games, you're a game player, or stop playing those mind games. And of course, his focus was on the negative games that we wind up in. I couldn't help think, though, about the Minecraft example, because there's a distinction in gaming between zero-sum games where there's a winner and a loser, and kind of infinite games where there is no particular end, and that's generally seen as a better kind of thing. I understand the concern about immersion, but there is a sense in which games where we don't try to basically beat out another person, but we just keep going, is seen as being beneficial in certain ways. But I love the point about silence. It also brings to mind listening, which is something we haven't talked about. That became an area of study in communication, and the question of being different kinds of listening that we can engage in. But one other thing, I think I have to put the plug. I'm glad you bring up general semantics. General semantics has experimented with game playing and with children's material. Ben, is it Cry of the Wolf? Is that the name of the book?
Yeah, I think so. Right?
Yeah, there's a book. I mean, if you go to the Institute of General Semantics store on their website, there is something. Do you recall what ages that was for? Maybe around 10 or 12?
I don't think it's really young kids.
It's sort of like intermediate, but and it does teach that kind of idea of paying attention and understanding how we take in and evaluate information about our environment, which is what Mike is referring to as abstracting. So it's not too expensive, right?
No.
Do you remember how much?
It's a really cool looking book. I have not read it, but
I gave it to my son, but he was a little too old when I gave it to him, but he said he thought it was interesting though.
How old was he when you gave it to him?
23.
No, he was in his teens. He was, I think maybe 15 or something around there. I think it's more for maybe 8 or 10 years old, somewhere in that area. So I'll throw these just different ideas out for you to comment on or to comment on each other.
I'm going to say, storytelling, just the idea that you tell a story, besides the content of the story, is that the child listens to it. And I notice a pattern. When you start to tell a story, there's a time at the beginning of the story where the kids are talking, they're distracted, but at some point you have them hooked.
Right.
And they get into the narrative. So they're learning narrative just by listening to you and they're following the story. And they always have a million questions when the story's done. Well, what happened to him? Or what happened to this? So I think narrative is really important, and just the act of telling the story. And plus, when you tell a story, you're picking the story, as opposed to the video game or the television, right? So you can pick out stories that have real value to it. Because when you watch the stories on television, you would never talk to a kid that way. Sometimes there's vulgarity in that story, there's sexuality in that, just things that you wouldn't talk to a child that way. And if you did, you'd be fired if you were a teacher. But yet it's on television all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but when you tell a story, you can really pick a story that have real meaning to them. I mean, so many beautiful stories. And from around the world, just Greek mythology. And kids like those things.
Yeah,
Isn't that a bit racy though, Bob?
Can you open it up?
We will.
I'm good.
Well, let me just say something to what you talk about these games that are non-ending.
Yeah.
What did you call them? Eternal games?
Yeah, I don't remember. Immersive games. Yeah.
Because Wiesinger, was he Dutch?
Huizinga?
Huizinga.
I think it was Dutch, yeah. Johan.
Yeah, he's Dutch.
Johan.
Yeah.
Huizinga. All right,
Or
Huizinga.
from Holland, maybe that was it.
But he talks about play as a magic circle, that a child enters that magic circle, is completely immersed in that magic circle, but then he leaves that circle. He kind of knows this is play, and now I'm back to the real world. And I think what you're describing is that they never come back to that real world.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm talking about being conditioned to be the servants of the digital, you know, I mean, that sort of dystopian view, like that we're all basically just servo mechanisms for the digital, like, thing. It just concerns me that, you know, at a certain point, that all the fears that we have about our lack of face-to-face communication are replaced by, you know, the fact that your son's best friends across the street, but they go home to play with each other, is that, you know, the fears that we have as people who were born outside of that environment are not shared by the people who are currently sort of moving in the direction of that environment, including people our own age who happen to be technophiles and things and see it as a wonderful sort of outcome. But that we are going to watch as this becomes increasingly our reality wherever we go. And the things that we've noticed over the last 10 years, say, with our students, are going to be the norm everywhere, right? And it's going to get more intense than this. And so I think this is this important moment in history where we have to be concerned with some of the things that, you know, some of the things that we've brought up as valuable and important, being co-present with one another and to tell stories to one another. And you know, as a person who comes to all of this, you know, through my own exploration and finding Neil Postman's work, the thing that turned me on to it at the beginning was the idea of languaging, and the idea that one of the most basic human superpowers, one of the most basic defining elements of our humanity, is our capacity to language as a process. And that's why, you know, doing the exercise with silence, doing the exercise with the writing, and other things like this are my sort of small attempt to work with language and get people to fall in love with language again. The main concern that I have, frankly, is that students are pushed to become great writers. They don't quite know why they're being pushed to be great writers. It's not that in their lives they're going to be forced to write in this sort of traditional essay form any longer, and no one can quite explain to them what benefit it is, and trying to explain to students that the benefit of it is as a form of organizing your thoughts that will eventually work its magic on you in reverse, to train you to use language in an analytical way, to express yourself in a clearer way, to build ideas and grow and participate in intellectual work. The thing that's missing from that is that they don't have the training in their spoken lives anymore. Is the emphasis, because schooling is based on literacy and numeracy, is to turn people into wonderful readers and writers and doers of math. And we've lost some of that original emphasis on the storytelling, on the ability to become a good storyteller and the ability to become a good conversationalist. And the building blocks for that are some of the things that you mentioned about, even before children can understand language, is actually engaging with them and having this back and forth, this, you know, playing catch game with language, or even with gesture or with recognition. People in our classrooms, if we're teaching in college environments, are bad at that stuff. And part of it is because I think we've been locked into old modes of teaching that emphasize literacy and numeracy before we've done the basic building block stuff of languaging at its core, at that orality level. And in order to sort of save ourselves from whatever thing we think we're running headlong into, from my point of view, I gave a talk at the Institute of General Semantics Symposium last year called Compose Thyself. And it's the idea that composition is used to talk about writing, but it's this interesting metaphor about, composing your interior. We talk about compose yourself when somebody loses control of their emotions and things, is doing this interior composition work through, meditation in silence and then through, improving your inner monologue, right? And doing it through a better use of language, which is what general semantics is really good at. And all of that kind of basic stuff is missing. And so when you get students into a classroom today and they're socialized through all these kinds of distractions and these digital things that we're occupied with, part of what's happened is they've spun out of control and it's become normalized because they haven't had that basic foundational work, and we failed to give it to them at any level any longer. So, you know, each of the things that we've talked about, I think, find their roots in basic composition of yourself in your interior. It's the oral creatures that we are.
And it's not just the. By the way, may I point out? Look at how good we are at turn taking. Do you see? Right? You know, we're giving everybody.
I'm scared of Lance. Actually, I'm just scared of Lance. So.
Well, he's over there plotting his next response. But it's not just about the media that are dominant now, right? But about. I mean, you've already talked about it. The structure of schooling and how we, whoever we are, right, have shoved that stuff down younger and younger and younger to the point that it's in preschool. Yeah. There are things in preschool that don't belong anywhere near that age. And now more than ever, I guess I appreciate my university has this has a preschool that they've had since the 70s, and it was made in this very 70s kind of way based on Reggio Emilia, which sounds more like a food right than a whatever, a philosophy, but it's a place in Italy. The point is that it's entirely play-based, and one of my kids got to go there, the other one didn't, and they're both fine now, but the point is that I saw the difference between a more conventional, contemporary, structured preschool experience, which was nice, and she was happy there, my daughter was happy, but it was very much like, here's what we're going to do now, here's the project we're going to do, here's what we're going to do now we're going to paint, and now we're going to do that, where my son got to spend these 2 years in this space where the idea basically is just, we're going to have lots of wonderful potential experiences for you here, and you, now of course they also had a lot of students, you know, an army of graduate students. It takes a lot of people to do this. You guys, you kids, you do your thing, you know, we're going to spend hours outside where there will be fun things to do. Inside, you know, over here you can, there's Legos, there's blocks, there's paint, there are books over here if you're into it, but they would not, even when I wished they would push my son just a little bit to like put a crayon in his hand, because he seemed to be not going to be ready for kindergarten in a more conventional context where he was headed, they wouldn't do it because we don't do that when we don't tell them what to do, and it's very much play based and talk and you know, how do you think this kid feels about what you just did, like all of that kind of just interaction with one another. That was all it was about, and that was really more what they considered the foundation to everything that will come later, and that will the math will come later. You know, don't worry about it. Just let it go for now. But it's very hard to get parents to trust that.
Definitely, especially when all the publicity is about STEM and all these things. People think, you know, if my child falls behind in math and science because they don't get it in the first grade or kindergarten, whoa, what am I going to do?
ABC Mouse, right? You see these commercials.
Yeah.
You seen these commercials?
What commercials is this?
ABC Mouse and things, these softwares, these programs. My kid, there's one about like my kid was sick for a couple of months and he was falling behind in school. You know this one? You know, so we got him ABC Mouse and now everything's okay because, you know, and you see the kid with the mouse, you know, like clicking on letters and it's all going to be okay now because he's got ABC Mouse. And,
That's sort of ironic because...
Is that a cue?
It's hard for us to dance.
That's a little weird.
Come on, everybody. This is what kids need. A little spontaneity.
It is.
Da, da, da.
Come on, sing along.
Yeah, thank you.
That's not good.
That was cool, yeah.
You said play too many times.
Play, yeah, play. Siri, play some background music, yeah. Well, no, but it's ironic because, I mean, we're so anxious about STEM, where we're doing so poorly. Now, Bob and I, being old people, we grew up at you know, it was the Cold War, and that was what was emphasized. I mean, you know, we were all about math and science. I mean, I don't know about you, Bob, but
No science. I went to Catholic school.
oh, okay.
God made everything.
Well, in public school, they really we actually had a very poor education, or they de-emphasized the humanities, you know, and just like really pushed us on science and math. which, you know, I mean, it was a sacrifice that was worthwhile because we won the Cold War. Thank you.
Did we
But
really?
but it was that.
Sure
But
we
we were
did.
the same generation that was do your own thing. You know, when it came to play, you know, it was like all like, you know, hey, whatever. You know, let's put baking soda and vinegar together, see what happens, or let's play with matches. Nobody's looking, you know, just to see what, you know, or see if you can light this leaf on fire with this magnifying glass or whatever. So I mean, it's just funny that we had both of those sides. I did want to comment. I mean, I think it's great the continued importance on narrative, and sometime later after Homo ludens, I think the fellow's name was Fisher, who came up with Homo narrans, you know, that is, we're storytelling animals, and really the importance of narrative, not the least for memory and time binding, because narrative provides the structure for us to retain important information, and that's, you know, key mnemonic in oral culture, and it remains one for us that we learn better with narrative when things are put into a narrative format. And I love the point about composing yourself, because again, that goes to role playing. We play roles, that becomes who we are, the roles that we play. Do you want to continue, or do you want to turn it over to? Do you have more? Do you want to see what we hear from the peanut gallery?
You want to sing a little bit?
Sure.
Sing a little birdie, or shall we get?
I have a question.
Well, you see, we have questions. Do you want to entertain questions?
Sure.
Or
My question is for
okay.
Peggy. Do they teach interpersonal communications at your college? In your community, I used to teach that, so I'm sort of curious as to how they go about that now.
A little bit. My department.
They don't have a course called
have a
interpersonal
course.
communication.
We don't call it that. That's another story. Anyway, we call it communication and behavior, and no one knows what that is, so they don't want to take it because they're not sure what that would mean. So we. Such a long story. Every university, I think now, for accreditation purposes, if not for any good pedagogy, has to have goals, right? Learning goals.
assessment.
Right. So, and the point of that is that one of my university's goals is communication, written and oral. I think of it, and so they have to take. Everyone has to take a course, one of any number of courses that have been deemed to have enough of its content geared toward that thing. And so, in theory, they're supposed to at least get some exposure to some
Shocking.
kind of oral communication, and interpersonal, I guess, would be one of them. Public speaking would be one. It's hard though, because it's not, you can't do anything in one course, right? I mean, you can sort of give some people a couple of ideas, but unless it's something that's kind of built in across the board, through everything, like through conversation in class, whatever the class is, right?
Yeah,
Having
that
them
was
talk
my
to
next
one
question.
another.
Do they
or-
talk to each other? Do you set them up to have a conversation? Do they practice
don't talk to
listening
each other.
skills? It sounds like from what you said that if you actually set up an experiment with them talking to each other, you'd be in trouble.
I definitely try. I teach a first-year seminar.
I find that amazing.
Yeah, I mean, where I do have them do some kind of research project. It doesn't even matter what it is. The point is for them to do it together, where they have to work in groups of 5 or 6 on anything, just so that they talk to one another. And we have these really cool rooms now in our library. They're called collaboration studios, as if you needed, but they're cool because they're little conference rooms with a table that you can sit around and a screen. You can project your work. Anyway, they like it, and it's like sliding glass doors and stuff, and I can walk around like a doctor and check in with everybody. But at least they're all kind of facing each other and talking to one another, and they sort of manage to put together some kind of presentation. It's usually not very good, but they're freshmen, and whatever, it's fine. But for that purpose, right, just to have them meet each other, because then when they're all together again, they know each other a little bit, and they are more inclined then to talk to one another than they were when it was just 25 people in the room with their phones and me up front saying.
And
"Please
they
put your phone
allow
away."
the phones in the classroom. This I find amazing.
It's weird because tell me what you guys do. I mean, you can try to say no, and you can do it. There are ways to enforce it. Having said that, it's an uphill battle. I mean, it's a losing battle, right? Because they are going to take them out. You know, I've tried to draw the line at no large screens. You know, it sounds so stupid as I'm saying it. Not that I say use your phones wherever you want, but at least like put your laptop away. There's nothing we're gonna do that's so complex that you need to like be taking notes on your laptop. So at least like put those screens down and try to keep your phones away. It's very hard.
Do they
I can't
resent
wait
it
to call
when
my
you tell them
colleagues
to
to
put
ask
away, or they just do it? Or...
If you really enforce it and stay with it, they'll settle into it. You know, it's more like drift as the semester goes along. You know, it starts out really good, gangbusters. I think they're determined to, like, I'm going to pay attention this semester. And then little by little, and you have to decide how much energy you want to spend saying, I see that, I see your phone, I see your phone, I see you back there. You know.
I'm going to share something. I live in a neighborhood where I'm in a laboratory of different age groups. And I'm walking along the street, and I see a van, and I see all these students from the high school that's nearby lined up.
I know.
And they're
yes.
checking in their telephones.
Yes.
I was totally amazed by this. So I'd imagine that they could do something about it in college as well.
Yeah, and I've done it.
It seems a little strange to me, and I find it absurd that they don't teach classes where kids get to talk to each other, because communication is about conversation.
Can I tell you something you won't like?
Well, I already know it.
I let them use whatever they want, and because I'm not interested in being the police for them, and I have 2 kids, like I don't need to be a parent to them, and I also so that's just my own. That's my own sort of not wanting to be that role in the classroom, but I also think it's important, and in wrestling with what to do about it, I've taken 2 approaches, and the first approach is I typed up a 1 sheet of habits for the successful student, and I've said, if you find that your performance isn't up to your own standard or the standard that I expect of you, here are some things that might help you, and here are some things that may be hurting you. And so that is a teaching moment that I use. And the other one is, if there is a speaking component to the course and they're not being a good audience member, I then put on the parental hat and I say, no, I not only want you to be a good audience member to your peers who've worked very hard just as you have, but the best audience, right? And actually they respond really well to it. But I think it's a losing battle, as you said, and I think they're going to have to learn to cope with it on their own at some point. And, you know, at a certain point, someone's got to stop parenting them about it, and they have to sink or swim on their own, which is why I do the 1 sheet thing where I say, one of the habits that will lead to your, you know, difficulty will be divided attention and this kind of thing. And so, you know, it comes up. If somebody's performance isn't going well, I say, hey, yeah, I've seen you on your laptop in class. That way I think it comes across, but yeah, I don't police it.
Yeah, I think just 9/11, 9/11 made a difference. I mean, before 9/11, we were saying, you know, turn your phones off, and afterwards, you know, just really had to say, you know, allow that, because you never know what something important might come through. So, but I know you've been waiting patiently. So we'll work on turn taking. And please go ahead.
Okay. Well, we're all talking about communication and various ways of communicating. Now, through the ages, there have been very many ways of communicating. Originally, it was all oral to the person sitting next to you. Then it got to be broader with a person like in an audience. And then as we progressed, if you want to use that word, it's now not a question of communicating with a large audience that's in front of you, but it's communicating with people who are far away or who are maybe next to you, with a device that helps you to do that. I remember I was growing up in the 1800s when there was no, when television became the big thing. And my mother said, no television for you. You got to do your homework. You got, you know, she didn't realize, and I probably couldn't realize, it's a wonderful way of communicating and finding out information. Better than reading books sometimes, and better than talking to people right next to you. So we have to think of the sort of the venue that we're in now in this world. In some ways, these little devices are better than the big thing. I know when I was teaching, they had these little things, and they were talking to people far away and getting information that I would never be able to do, you know. So you can't say this is better than that. You have to sort of encompass everything, and that's my opinion. And the problem is that the person who is structuring this whole thing, like the teacher, has their own views about how to structure. I think that your view is very good. You're saying you will learn better this way. No, and you learn better this way, and we have to, make room for the different ways of communication. So that's our job, and we're all older than these little kids who are second nature. It's very hard for us to see that, but I think in some ways, and also it could be sort of, you're not looking around you. Like I see people on the street and they're talking, and they're not looking at the scenery, they're not looking at the traffic, and that's terrible, I mean, in my eyes. But they're communicating with somebody in Japan, which is good for them. But there sort of has to be a middle ground, where you take in all that's around you, don't forget about it, but also communicate individually with people. And that's very hard to do.
And
it's very hard to get that
I'm really sympathetic to that point of view. The thing that strikes me about this particular conversation is that the classroom is an environment, and the context of the classroom has a certain set of governing principles. What's it for? It's for co-presence. It's for orality. It's for listening and speaking and having conversation. Certainly, I mean, it could be for lecturing. I do my fair share of that, which is certainly not maybe the most interesting way to experience co-presence, is to be lectured at. But if your attention is divided and your attention is somewhere outside that room, there's almost no point to being in the room in the first place. That the classroom, that the introduction of that technology to the classroom as an environment dramatically changes the nature of the environment and what's happening there. In many ways, it breaks down. And so either we rethink the environment in which we are schooling, we rethink schooling itself, or we have to rethink the presence of that technology in the room. We have a number of choices. And so creating a sound policy for how to preserve the value that we have of this traditional environment is hard. I don't think there's necessarily one great clear answer to it.
Well, it may not be most valuable. There are places in Australia that are far apart, and the kids learn by watching television. They don't have a school environment. So it's a question of what do you think is a better environment, and also how you think a person should act. You can't impose your ideas of the past.
It's not a democracy.
Well, it's hard to impose your ideas of the past on the present.
It is true.
You have to be flexible, I guess that's the word.
But on this point about Australia, there's a wonderful documentary. I think it was done originally for PBS about distance learning that Neil Postman appears on as the sort of presenting the opposite side. And at some point, he says about this that, it may be that we need to do this, to say have television to link people up. It may be that it's just not convenient or not possible to have people co-present. And he compares it to a child who doesn't have a father. That, okay, we'll set up a system, a big brother system, so someone will act like a father for a period of time, but it's still sad that the kid doesn't have the father. And in the same way, it's like something that we shouldn't be celebrating, the fact that we have to resort to these kind of technological fixes. We should be sad, about that.
Well, maybe it's good that he doesn't have an abusive father. You could look at it that way. And in the future,
but that has nothing to do with the point about a big brother, a big
okay.
brother system. Where
but in the future, there will be no teachers. It'll just be the screen.
Well, that's hard to really believe. But we have other questions. So, Michelle, you wanted to? Oh, you want to go?
Well, I just wanted to defend as an undergrad who doesn't go on her phone. If I think Professor can back me up on this, I don't go on my phone that much. And as a student who's went to honor classes in high school, we were very much frowned upon to look at our phones, and we respected that. We respected our professors, and even if our professors ask us, I have a text and context professor who says there are no laptops in this class. If you open your laptop, you lose your participation grade. And I think we respect that as students. I know at Fordham we try to respect that as much as possible, if that's a certified rule in the classroom. I think, but there is a huge advantage as students who grow up in an international world, in an international just society, is that maybe sometimes I use my laptop to look up what's the information we're talking about, what's going on in the news. I know I look at it for my international communications class, is to see what we're talking about right now, what's going on in this argument currently. I think it's important to realize that there are extreme advantages of it, and that's the world that we're growing up in. And I think the more that the older generations look down at us, the older generations are always going to look down at us for every new generation, but
you
there's
look down
still
at someone someday.
Yeah, no, I've been a camp counselor. I get it.
Pass it on.
But it's always it's gonna be that angst. It's gonna be that angst of, oh, they're always on their phones, and we're gonna turn around and be like, okay, if you think that, then yeah, we will use our phones, and we will. And that, I think it's just to have trust and respect.
That's a great point.
The society we grew up in.
But I think you're a better student because your teachers taught you to restrain that.
Yeah.
And the same thing with you. I think it was a good thing that your mother told you to turn off the television. You're doing your homework. All right? I don't think you can do television and do homework. You can't do those things. Because my father did the same thing. I think I wouldn't have gotten a doctorate degree if my father said, go ahead and watch television while you're doing your homework.
Depends on what you're watching on television.
No, it doesn't. If you're doing homework, you're doing homework.
But it's also on the side of structural structure that we were talking about, is how much, to the point of how much can you tell them what to do, and they have to figure out on themselves. Is a lot of times, I know conformity is everyone has their laptops out. I'm gonna probably pull out my laptop eventually, but there's also, it's just the structure of most of my classes I don't use my laptop because I figured out for myself that's how I learn better.
Can I just say that I think the reason that I'm a little more open about it and a little bit more sensitive to not policing is because as an undergraduate, I always tell my students this, is that I was a terrible student. I always say this freely now because I'm here. I can say this now. That as an undergrad, I was a great student growing up as a kid. I loved school, and I was curious about things. I had great teachers, and I got to a certain point where I came to my undergrad life, and I didn't want to be there at all. I didn't want to be in those desks. I didn't want to be confined in that environment anymore. There was a world waiting for me, and I thought I would go run headlong into it and figure things out. And instead, my father said, you must go to school. And in some ways he was right, and in some ways maybe he wasn't, I don't know. But I probably would have been a student on Facebook and YouTube and every other thing throughout the entire experience, because I also was not paying attention in class, and I just didn't have a computer. I wasn't paying attention in class. I didn't go to class. I didn't buy books. I crammed at the end, and I was smart enough to sort of pull off a B on a paper by writing it one night before. But at a certain point, something woke up in me that I thought, I'm wasting my time. I used to love school. It means I need to find something that I love doing. And I became a good student again. And school made sense to me suddenly. So if you're a person who's already high functioning in the environment, and you have that curiosity and you have a sense of purpose there, it's easier, I think, to refrain from distraction. And so those students who don't want to be there, I don't want to force them to be there. because they have to figure that part of it out on their own. And if I'm not saying something out of my mouth that compels them to, you know, think and be excited about something, then I don't know what to say to them, and I'm not going to punish them and hurt them in some way. They're paying the money to go there, their parents are, and eventually they're going to have to come, you know, there's going to be a come to Jesus for them at some point where they're going to have to figure out, you know, what's my purpose in life or whatever. And it's not going to come from me policing them in the classroom, which is why I give them that sheet ahead of time to say, if you're struggling in here, it may be due to these reasons. And one of the reasons could be that, you know, you're not engaged, I think. So, yeah, I'm totally sympathetic to the fact that the technology in the classroom can be used as a complement. It can be used as a complement to what we're all engaged in. And I know students do that, but more students than not, I think, are, you know, doing other things.
Yeah. I'm just going to say I agree with Mike on this, and I didn't have any limitations. I watched lots of TV.
Yeah.
Actually, the big thing was comic books, right? I mean, I loved comic books, and they were always like, you shouldn't be reading comic books. Later on, it was like, we're glad they're reading anything. Someone older than us, Paul Levinson, who some of you know, Dr. Levinson, and for him it was science fiction, where his school librarian didn't want to let him read science fiction because they thought it was like a kind of degraded form of literature. So I think that, and that relates a lot, Peggy, to your, you know, going back to the 19th century. But we have another question back there. Let's hear from another student.
That's okay. We can go with the student.
Oh.
Well, I just want to comment about what Professor Blue said. I think what you said about restructuring school is so important. What you just said was like exactly what I was going to comment before you took the words right out of my mouth. Is that what I realized as an undergrad is that our lives are so intensely structured up to the point of going to higher education. That's like, we don't even have the choice by the time, you know, I'm seeing my brother go through this now, where he's never liked school, he doesn't like school, he wants to do all sorts of stuff with bikes and cars and wants nothing to do with school, and yet every single thing he's learned from the first day of freshman year is that you have to do good on your SAT so that you can do good in college, so that you can get a good job, and there's no other option. And so when you get to college, you realize that most of the kids don't want to be there. And when you're the only one in a class of 9 who doesn't have your laptop, or one of 2 who doesn't have your laptop, you realize, okay, how many of these kids really actually want to be here? Or how many of their parents just said, well, this is what you're going to do, this is the next step. And if it's not their parents, then it's their guidance counselors. And if it's not their guidance counselors, then it's, you know, the school environment before that. And I think in a digital world where there are so many possibilities of distractions, but also so many possibilities of education, we have to relook at our, the structure of our society and the structure of pressuring students and young people that the only way they're going to get a good job, especially in a world where the trades are completely falling off the cliff, and you know, meanwhile they make $300 an hour to screw a nail in or something. You know, there are so many opportunities that kids my age were never opened up to. It was never an option. You're going to go to college, and I think that makes such a difference for the professor's perspective when you have all these kids sitting on their phones. It's because 90% of them don't want to be there in the first place.
Yeah, I think, you know, I always go back to Postman for this kind of thing, and we live in a different world than most of human history, where the problem throughout human history was how to solve the problem of not enough information, and we now live in a world of information glut, right? And that's the informing ourselves to death turn at the later part of Postman's career, where he began to talk quite a lot about information glut and the fact that if you want to know something, it's, you know, accessing knowledge is no longer a problem. You can learn how to fix your car engine on YouTube now, you know, and pause it in the appropriate places and turn the thing as it's supposed to be turned and wire the thing as it's supposed to be wired. You can learn just about anything. You could probably learn how to perform surgery on yourself these days by YouTube, right? And, you know, it's hopefully it's a credible source for the information, but, you know, fingers crossed. But it's not the same problem any longer. So what are the needs that students have? And that's why I keep coming back to this sort of basics. And, you know, if I had a thesis, I know you were talking about teaching as a creative activity. Is the thesis for my way of thinking about this is teaching as a humanizing activity, where we go back to some of the building blocks, not only about composing ourselves, but then in turn figuring out how it is that we relate to one another and what to do with all this information. What's the most humane way to use this information? What's the way that we can rethink old structures that no longer serve us well any longer, and to see things clearly in order to approach the world differently? And that's about play. It's about saying we have to be open to being amateurs again in a world where we don't know the rules, where the rules that we are using to run our politics, the rules we're using to govern our businesses and our legal system and our schooling and all these things served us really well for a long time, but are we really aware of what the structures are that actually govern our lives any longer? Maybe what we need to do is step away from it, play as though the rules are all different, uncover those rules, and figure out new structures that serve us better. And I've always been partial to Postman's teaching as a subversive activity in his early work, because I feel subversive in this way. But I think in some sense the other end of the argument is the teaching as the conserving activity argument, is that if we are running headlong into an uncertain future, sometimes it's the old structures that are familiar to us that remain important. And I think that that's where our use of language is really at the root of it, is remembering that the conserving aspect of our culture is our capacity to language with one another and do time binding from a general semantics point of view.
You know, there's another, not to completely punt this off, but just for 2 minutes to say this, because it's just occurring to me that something that happened earlier today is sort of relevant to the idea of school needing to do things differently, or to think, you know, what do we need schools to be doing? It's not just about the technology, it's about, with any luck, the greater variety of kinds of people who are coming to the academic setting. What I mean specifically for my institution is that at a chairs meeting today, we were talking about the fact that for about 5 years now, we have had a program that actively recruits students on the autism spectrum. And now this year, our freshman class, about 10%, is in this program. It's called Bridges to Adelphi, and there are special supports in place. And but what's interesting, it's great, and it's also very challenging, because none of us have any training. It's very challenging to work with. Some of them you wouldn't necessarily know, but in terms of conversation and working in the context of a group, and it's very hard to do, especially when you have like 4 or 5 or 6, let's say, students on the autism spectrum, and they're, you know, they've got very unique individually and within the context of autism. It's just all very interesting, and of course everybody else really needs to learn how to interact with these students, and vice versa, and us, and some of what we traditionally do just doesn't work in that context at all, or it's kind of hit or miss. It's just a very long and complicated story, but my point is just that it's about a lot of things more than just cell phones and laptops.
Oh, yeah.
So teaching involves play as well. I know Michelle got put off, so we really...
That's okay, I have like 40 things to say. But
Well,
I've been putting them in my
You
phone.
can get 39 of them.
Right? I've been putting them on my phone, so I look like I'm texting, but really I'm just being productive. So as a millennial, teaching millennials, because I grumble, I am technically a millennial. Something that I've come to know in my 8 years of teaching at higher education is that they really need big gestures and putting them in uncomfortable situations. So, as I said in the beginning, I put them in circles. I never lecture to them, and I make them say, well, what are you, because I teach writing and literature, what are you discovering about the reading? It doesn't matter what I tell you. And what I found, and I do put like the no cell phones, you don't need a laptop. What I started to find is they police each other. Like, hey, Sarah, listen to me, put your phone down. So I don't even need to do it. They started doing it. And one of the reasons why, I think, is in the beginning, I make them walk around and shake each other's hands, because they don't know how to shake hands. Literally. They've never, they don't know, and I got the limp ones, and I teach them, and I walk around and I make them, and they go like, what? My professor is coming up to me and shaking my hand, and I make them all get up. Do we do icebreakers anymore? Do we do this? Is this a thing?
I used to. I haven't recently, but yeah.
Oh, I make
I like that
every
too.
semester I make them get up, shake hands, and they each put like interesting things about themselves that aren't physical attributes. And they're like, hi, are you the person who speaks 7 languages? No. And they have to find it. And they shake each other's hands. So this idea of big gestures that I find they start to police each other. Put your phone away. And then they just stop. I can't tell you that this semester, because I'm finished on Monday, was really no cell phone issues at all. They loved talking to each other. And another thing, I mean, I put down so many things. This idea of the words and the plays, I've really been teaching them to broaden their definitions of words. So I teach writing as an argument, classic rhetoric, and they can't get past that idea of argument not being aggressive. So again, I attach the big gestures, and my comments on their papers are rather rude. And I put blah, and meh, and I don't care, make me care. Oh yeah. And then they come back to me and they say, well, why did you put meh? And I'll put like MEH period. And then I say, read that sentence out loud to me. And they're like, oh, that was a rather boring sentence that said absolutely nothing. So what I'm finding, and you know, in this generation, which I can't really separate myself from, but I can because I'm a little bit older, is that they really do need these big gestures to put them outside their comfort zone. And then the phone, it's not an issue anymore. And the awkward silences, which I do make them sit with. I'm like, I'm okay with it. I'll sit here with you and be silent. And then they get so uncomfortable that it starts the conversation. And that was something that was hard for me to learn as, you know, when I started teaching, to sit and be comfortable with the silence. And so I can see from their point of view, learning the silence. So just this idea of big gestures, learning how to argue, being rude in a way that's constructive. Like I really put in all their thesis statements, I don't care, you need to make me care, the reader being me. And then that helps them. And at first they're like, oh, you're so mean. And now by the end they're like, I'm writing papers like a pro and I can clearly prove my argument and persuade my reader, and that's my end goal. And so I don't even find that I need to tell them anymore about the technology or anything like that. They just don't do it. They want to talk to each other. And so I love it. That's why I'm all about the circle. I don't do the lectures anymore. I know I'm beautiful, but you know, they can look at each other. So that's how I think about it. So I've had a totally different.
I want to say something related to that. I'm a drama teacher and a movement teacher. And what I'm finding is that there's a disconnect to sensing. Sensing, like the silence puts them in sensing, the handshake puts them in sensing, and that we're locked in. One of my teachers that I worked with taught me the work of Rudolf Laban, that we're stuck in forward sagittal. We're stuck in the forward space. That's where the circle, I think, opens them up. There's no sense of backspace. There's no sense of environment. There's no feeling sense in the body. It's mostly through thinking and intuiting, and we're losing feeling and sensing. And that's what the digital world is robbing from. The experience of life, of discovery, of learning, happens through other processes. And that's what we focus on in training an actor. And they also explore that about human nature. You know, is the character a thinking character or are they a sensing character? So we have these different aspects to ourselves that we're losing touch with. And if you look at the Waldorf schools that work with Steiner, they work with eurythmy. It puts you in circular dimensional experience. They farm. They're working with tangible sensorial objects and experience. And that shifts them into another way of learning that's not stuck in a narrow spatial dynamic that locks out so much of the possibilities. And when I talk to my students, I said you lose connection to the playground and to your imagination and to your experience of the sensorial world, which disconnects you from so much possibility. And so that's where I think the drama is interesting. When you talk about the storytelling, it's putting them in that place, and the circle is putting them in that place.
Could I comment on that?
Yeah.
When I started working with children, we used to work from the circle all the time. But now there's so much technology in the classroom, you can't do it anymore. It's like it's just static. And plus, there's so much emphasis on the STEM. I just want them to do well on the standardized testing. Is that they have no patience with the stuff you're talking about.
Well, that's what, it's really interesting. Rudolf Laban did studies when he was in Dartington Hall on the workforce,
And that's how he discovered what's called effort actions. Everyone's moving forward, sagittal, pushing, pulling, and they were very much in a directional format. And so he told the factory owners to give them free form movement during their recess. He said, give them a half an hour more recess. The productivity in the factories tripled. These studies are dark. So the thing is, if you give the students sensorial connection, or this concept of silence, where you're connected to your feeling, sensing body, your ability to imagine and your ability to create and your ability to comprehend expands.
No, I agree with that. No.
And mine don't even use technology when they're in the circle anymore. They don't need it. They don't care. They just speak with each other. They engage with each other. So the phones, they're not out, and the computers, I tell them, like you had mentioned, you don't need it. You can write it all down. And it's kind of serendipitous, as you were saying. I literally just picked my final exam reading, and it's from New York Times. And it was, laptops in the classroom. No, it's something like that, a title. I can get it after. And it talks about this idea that students are so used to just typing from what they're hearing in lectures that they're not actually absorbing anything. There's no sense of productivity. Yeah, but when you're handwriting, you learn to be more succinct and to get the important ideas down.
Because it lives in the sensing world.
Yeah, in the circle, there is no technology. I don't even show clips, nothing. I don't use it at all. And they're like, do we get to watch movies? No, you don't need it.
I don't let actors use cell phones.
I teach writing and literature this semester. I'm teaching intro to composition. Oh, Fairleigh Dickinson.
Fairleigh Dickinson.
Yeah.
I'd like to, Ben, you wanted to add something?
Really briefly, I was filming you for a second. It was much more interesting to watch you rather than watch the screen. I could have I had feelings that I don't experience when I'm looking through a monitor. So it was interesting to film you at the moment that you were talking about sensorial experiences. Lest we forget, there was a general semantics scholar named Anatole Rappaport, who was also a scholar in game theory. Games and play are an obvious concept that overlaps. What I found fascinating about Anatole Rappaport, there was a game called The Prisoner's Dilemma and a book written about it, where they ran testings of what's the best strategy in this particular game.
This. It's extraordinary. Yeah.
Anatole Rappaport, oddly enough, won both rounds of the game, and he won it through a strategy called tit for tat, which was basically, if my opponent cooperates, I cooperate. If my opponent cooperates, I cooperate. If my opponent competes, then I compete. And you can get screwed a little bit, but it was overall the best strategy, at least among the people who submitted strategies in that. Now, what play and games, at least it seems like some people are saying here, and the value of them is also mirrored in this structured environments that you're talking about. Play seems to interrupt structured environments and teach people new value systems, temporary shifts in values, so they can open up new skills and maybe handle new environments. That specific book in which Anatole Rappaport won a couple rounds of game theory taught me the skill of tit for tat. I remember being bullied online, and on this message board where I was, there was a rule: don't be an asshole. But plenty of people I thought were assholes to me, and I wasn't getting protected, so I had to stand up for myself. I did not know how to do that, but I learned from that book and those values espoused in that game and in that strategy to stand up for myself. And while I didn't necessarily do tit for tat, it was more like tit for tat tat tat. So I might get hit 3 times, and maybe I'd stand up for myself. One last concluding point. I also work as a teacher teaching improv, and what I find really fascinating about improv is you're improvising scenes. You're improvising as people usually in situations that are not where you're playing not yourself. So you are coming up with. You're forced to behave in ways that with which you're not familiar. And one of the fascinating things I find about that kind of behavior is people who might say that I can't do this suddenly are playing characters who can do that which they say they can't do. And thus, at the end of it, they're blessed with these skills now that may be rudimentary, but they can go forward and learn things. I guess that's more of a comment than a question, but I will open up if you have any thoughts maybe about what play teaches as far as values or as skills, if there's anything additional.
I think, I keep turning back to Postman tonight, which I think is quite natural maybe in some ways in the subject, but I was always struck early on when I was reading Postman's books at the idea that public schools are there in order to form a public. and where is it that we learn to
Citizenship.
participate in a public, right? And so I think, since the subject that we teach and where general semantics might fit in this sort of siloed academic environment is communication, go back to the roots of communication, commune, community, and so forth, and that whatever game we're playing, when we're talking about having better conversations or being less distracted or participating in our school environments and so forth, the end game is to have better communities, is to actually be in better social relations with other human beings, and we're really, really bad at that right now, and for a variety of reasons. And it's an easy sort of thing to blame it all on being online and this kind of thing. I think people have found one another. People who feel lost in the world because they've been marginalized in one way or another have found each other online and found a beautiful sense of community that's empowered them and given them hope and opportunity and given them the ability to see their own value and so forth. So I think that's an easy answer to say that these kind of technologies have stunted us or hurt us in the ability to communicate completely. They've offered wonderful possibilities in that way. But I do think that if our concern really is to live better with one another, that the game we're ultimately playing at is a game that could come down to life or death, and it certainly comes down to something fundamental about our needs as human beings to be with one another, both for security and for all the rest of the things. But just homo ludens and all the rest of it, we are social creatures, and we need to play, we need to communicate, we need to continue on beyond ourselves and so forth. I think that's the game that we're playing ultimately, is the game of being human and being together in this odd journey that we've, however long it continues for human beings on this earth, we have to be good at it. And the world is our laboratory, the world is our classroom in the sense, and if we've opened up the possibility that people can access information and use it to benefit one another in addition to hurt one another, our responsibility ultimately is to turn people on to the possibilities of communication for good. And I think there's a moral lesson in all of that that's at the heart of the whole thing.
I want to piggyback onto that because it's a great, really wonderful message. And Anatole Rappaport, I'm so glad you brought him up. I mean, if you're not familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, Google it and check it out, because it is a very simple kind of game that is meant as a model of disarmament, going back to the Cold War. But really in all situations, you have two sides that are armed to the teeth, and how do you get them both to disarm? And it was meant to model that. And by the way, the tit for tat strategy begins if I start on the good side by doing something good. And it's only if I get a negative response or if the other person starts negatively that I respond in kind. But Anatole Rappaport, aside from being a general semanticist, is considered one of the founders of peace studies, or sometimes it's called peace and justice studies. And it goes back to the origin of general semantics, because Korzybski's initial question was, why can't peace be as easy to build as a bridge? That is, why can't politicians build peace in the same way that engineers build bridges? Which is, of course, a great metaphor. And a similar line, Kenneth Burke, who's the great 20th century scholar of rhetoric, talked about the basic meaning, as you brought out, of communication, to commune, to come together, that it's about cooperation. And in looking at rhetoric, that rather than it being a contest where you try to turn people's minds, it's about identification, about people coming together. And partly this was in response to Korzybski that he came up with this, but that it's about building and increasing our common ground, and that even warfare is an enormous act of cooperation. And that's what we need to look for in game playing, in a sense, is our ability to cooperate with one another towards a goal, and of course, that goal should be a important one, a beneficial one for all of us. Since our time is almost up, I'd like to ask our panelists for if they want to conclude with a statement, and then I'll add a final word. But yeah.
In the remarks that I said, I didn't mention Neil Postman at all, and he's kind of at the heart of what I write about, so I kind of left him out because it's so obvious to me, I kind of left it out. But one of the questions he asks, and it's a very simple question, is ask not only what does the technology do, but what is it undoing?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to keep that in mind. What is it undoing? What parts of our humanity? And I like what you said about the building blocks. I think that's really important.
I don't know. I've said quite a lot already. I think Lance's influence has pushed me in the direction of really appreciating Wendell Johnson and the People in Quandaries book. It's a really excellent piece of work. It combines sort of S.I. Hayakawa's clarity with Korzybski's complexity in a really nice way. And I think the title of that book is always a nice reminder for me that people in quandaries, the state of our human condition is to be in a constant state of quandary, and all these tools and all these kind of things that we're talking about, including play, are there to sort of at least bridge over the quandaries, if not fix them, before we move on to the next one. So that's my sort of general semantics period on the end of it.
I'm sitting here racking my brains with something else to say. Just that this has all been very interesting, in particular as someone who teaches entirely undergraduates, just kind of thinking through all these different questions about who are those people right now, and what do we need to bring to the classroom, or what does the classroom need to be? How much do we try to keep of something from the past, or which part of the past, like the all the way back language part, the some way back literacy part, the now part. It's such a complicated thing to do that it's just always nice to kind of hear from a lot of different people about, just what's working and not working, and just what everybody's up to.
To communicate.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank our wonderful panelists, and yes, you can applaud. Which is a kind of game, right? The game of applause, which by the way, the typical applause is 8 seconds long. If it's less than 8 seconds, it sounds like applause that didn't work, that died out. If it's more than 8 seconds, it sounds like especially enthusiastic applause. Something to keep in mind. I always like to see if I can be the first person to applaud, to see, can you get it started? But in any event, thank you for your applause. Thank you for coming and participating in this session. As I said, this is the last of 2017, and we'll begin again. I have to reserve the library for this, but tentatively I'm thinking January 26th for our next session. And since there are going to be folks from out of town coming in, it just occurred to me that we might do a special section on Neil Postman, and 2018 marks the 50th anniversary of Postman's introduction of media ecology, which he defined at a point as general semantics writ large. So I think we're going to try to take advantage of this and have a special session on that to start off the new year. But if you're not, I think maybe a couple of you are maybe not subscribed. If you're not subscribed yet, NYSGS, New York Society for General Semantics, nysgs.org. If you're subscribed for updates, you'll get the message and about the future sessions. And please know that you're always welcome here to join us. Again, thank you very much, and good night.
1, 2,